Welcome to EESC 418 Lecture 3C, Technical Language. This will conclude our sections on grammar, so congratulations if you've survived this far. We're almost through the hard work and we'll be getting into the fun stuff next week. So with that, let's finish off this topic. We only have 4 things to talk about in this deck, so we're going to start with the plurals of Latin words and animal names. So these are kind of weird if you're used to the way we normally pluralize words in English, which is generally just add an S or an ES. And the reason is because these are Latin words which we use as the same word in English, and therefore we use the same Latin plural word. And you might be used to seeing this word one way or the other. So if we look at this table, I'm showing the singular and plural versions of several of these words. And the first thing I'll show you is the pattern. So you're probably used to seeing some of these words as a singular, some of them as a plural. So bacterium, medium, datum, quantum. You're probably more used to seeing the plural versions of these. Bacteria, media, data, quanta. Although you're probably more familiar with quantum than quanta. The next category is also Latin words, criterion, phenomenon, which pluralizes criteria and phenomena. You're probably more familiar with criteria than criterion. And the next category, formula, vertebra, formulae, vertebrae. Although we often pronounce that as vertebrae, but the technical Latin pronunciation is vertebrae. Anyway, you won't be marked on pronunciation, but you do need to know the spelling. So the next category is words that have multiple types of plurals, and these are also words that come from Latin, but we've anglicized the plural word. So index can be written as indices or indexes when they're plural. The word forum falls into that category as well. You might see forum written as fora or forums pluralized, and both of those are correct. The next are also Latin words that have the same singular and plural form. So series and species. It doesn't matter whether it's singular or plural. And then the last category here is lots of different types of animals which have the same singular and plural. And there is no guide to which of these animal names has a plural versus a singular that is different. You either have to memorize them or look them up. And my recommendation is, if you're not sure, just look it up. So every dictionary will tell you that. You can look it up online in a few seconds. I will come back to talk about the first 3 categories here. So these are different Latin words. And the reason I'm going to come back to these is because there are a lot of other words that we will use that fall into these same categories. And once you're used to seeing this pattern, you can generally tell what the singular or plural of a word will be because it follows a regular pattern. So these are based on whether the word is feminine, masculine, or neutral in Latin. So it's just like German and French, they have genders on their nouns, and with the plural version, it follows a very, very regular pattern. So knowing the pattern, you can then know what the plural will be. But again, if you're not sure, it's really quick and easy these days to look it up. Over time though, you'll get to recognize these patterns. So let's look at a couple of examples. These are examples that come up all the time in technical writing. Data is probably the most common that is erroneously written. And I understand that data might be correct in the United States. It's definitely not correct in English technical writing to use data as a singular. So the data provides a compelling line of evidence. You might hear that all the time. It might sound right, but you should write it as the data provide, or if you don't like using data as a plural word, you can just say the data set, and now it's a singular. So the data set provides a compelling line of evidence. So it's a subtle nuance, but it is good to get it right. Another one that we see incorrect fairly often is people assuming that the singular of species is specie. People say this quite a bit. It's incorrect. So the entomologist identified every invertebrate species. You might hear that. It's incorrect. It should say the entomologist identified every invertebrate species. The singular and plural are the same. So the next category are demonstrative pronouns with ambiguous antecedents. So that's a mouthful. So let's talk about what I mean by that. A demonstrative pronoun is one of these 4 words: this, that, these, or those. And remember, a pronoun is a word that we use to replace another word. Him, her, this, that, these, those. They're all pronouns. We use them all the time without thinking about it. And the reason it can become confusing is because when we're writing something, we don't think about what we mean when we use one of these words, and then we assume that the reader will know that as well. So moving on, the antecedent is the word that comes first. In other words, the noun to which the pronoun refers. So I'll use an example here. My favorite course is analytical chemistry. This is a third-year course. So in this example, the demonstrative pronoun is this. It's one of these 4 words you see here. The antecedent is analytical chemistry. That is the word to which this refers. In other words, we could also say my favorite course is analytical chemistry. Analytical chemistry is a third-year course. It is correct and it is unambiguous, but it's a little bit longer and it sounds a little bit repetitive. So we shorten it to this. Where we run into problems is when we have multiple nouns in the first sentence and it's no longer clear which of these is the antecedent. In other words, if you look at the example I've got here in red, the biologist quickly inserted the scalpel into the specimen's eyeball, leaving enough time to study for the exam. This was going to be on his mind for the rest of the day. What does this refer to? Is it the scalpel, the eyeball, the exam, the act of studying? We really don't know, and it's impossible to say. So whoever wrote this probably knew exactly what this referred to, but the reader is left completely unaware of what the actual antecedent noun is. So this is easily corrected. The problem with this is it's not easily identified when we're reading our own work, because we read this and I can read this over and over again and I'll know exactly what I meant when I wrote this. And so it doesn't flash up in our minds that this could be hard for a reader to understand. So the trigger here that we need to warn ourselves is any sentence that starts with one of these 4 words where it's not explicitly defined which one of those antecedent nouns we're referring to. So it's easily fixed. All we need to do is add 1 word. And I've shown 2 different examples of how we can fix it. The first example refers to the overall concept of what this refers to. And the second is an explicit restatement of the noun. In other words, in the first corrected sentence, I've added this dissection. So this dissection was going to be on his mind for the rest of the day. You'll notice that I didn't use the word dissection in the first sentence. So now I've restated the antecedent as an overall concept. So what's going to be on his mind? The overall dissection. And that's actually what I meant the first time I wrote this, but it wasn't clear. The second thing I've written is an explicit word that refers us back to the antecedent. This exam was going to be on his mind for the rest of the day. So in this case, I've used the same word. It's a little bit repetitive, but it's crystal clear what I meant. The next one, for some reason, this happens to come up all the time in business writing, and I'll just be frank, it's super annoying. It's incorrect. It's just sort of like business jargon. So, and we're going to talk about jargon in later lectures. But to start with, me, myself, and I. Myself is a reflexive pronoun. It reflects back on myself. So to use it correctly, I taught myself how to code. So I did something to myself. I taught myself. The octopus camouflaged itself. And if we knew the octopus was a male or female, we could use himself or herself. But generally, when we're talking about an animal, we can just say itself. So the key point here is that myself is not a fancy substitute for I or me. So this is the type of thing that you'll hear all the time in business talk. Coincidentally, this is almost exactly the same example that Grammarly came up with, although I'd written this before I looked at the Grammarly page. So in the meeting, you will attend along with myself and a few others. This could totally be in an email that somebody would send in a business setting. So I've corrected that. It's grammatically correct, although I still wouldn't word it quite this way in the second sentence. In the meeting, you will attend along with me and a few others. So I've corrected this by simply using the right form of me, myself, or I. In the third sentence, I've corrected it even more by shortening it. So the key point here, though, is that myself, unless you're actually using it as a reflexive verb, please avoid it. Numbers have a few different rules. They're not always intuitive. I will mention that depending on where you're writing, whether it's an academic journal or a consulting report or an internal government report, there's usually a style guide that will tell you how to treat numbers in your report. So some style guides will say spell out all the numbers less than 10 and use figures for all the larger numbers. Some will say spell out all numbers under 100. It's really up to the style guide. There is no proper grammatical rule. In general, though, the shorter the number, the more likely we are to spell it out. There are some rules, though, about using numbers with units. And before I move on to that, though, I will mention that one of the hyphen rules is spelled out numbers that have more than one word should be hyphenated. Okay, so hyphenate numerical adjectives. So a numerical adjective is when we use a number to describe another word. So in this case, we're not simply saying the measurement was 3 meters. We're saying it was a 3-meter item. In this case, a 3-meter high tree. 3-meter high is the hyphenated adjective. So we need a hyphen in between the number and the unit. I went for a 25-kilometer run. So 25 hyphen km run. Next rule, if you're using units, use figures. So don't spell out a number and then put a unit after. That doesn't matter what the unit is. Just use the figure and a space and then the unit, which brings us to our last rule. Put a space between the number and the unit for almost all units. The exception to that is degrees. So we don't put a space in between degrees. I've put a few shortcut keys here. Better than a space is to use a non-breaking space, because you never know where that text might end up. And if it ends up at the end of a line and you've just used a regular space, your units will end up on the next line. So we covered this, I think, a little bit in last week's tutorial, but just a reminder, there's another shortcut to doing a non-breaking space. There's also a shortcut to the degree symbol. So it's one of these alt keys. You have to use your numeric keyboard. The numbers along the top of your keyboard will not work. A lot of people put a small letter O and then put a superscript on that O to turn it into a degree symbol. That doesn't work very well because sometimes the formatting gets lost and now it'll say 6OC. So use the proper symbol, Alt 0176, and that will give you a nice degree symbol. Okay, so this concludes our 3 weeks of grammar. I'm really happy if you stuck it out this far. I think the hardest part is done and the most fun is about to come. So next week we'll talk about how to make our writing really good, nice, clear, and readable. Not so much about fixing mistakes, but about making it something that people will be happy to read. So see you next week, and don't forget to do the practice quiz.